So this is our fourth snippet looking at politics and culture in the late 70s, early 80s. And this is going to look at early Reagan priorities. And Reagan was elected arguing that Carter and the Democrats were not paying enough attention to the Soviet threat. He promised to increase defense spending, to more aggressively confront the Soviet Union, both militarily and rhetorically. And he largely delivers on that promise. And you can sort of see from this chart, U.S. defense spending dramatically increases during the Reagan years, especially a heavy rate of increase in the first Reagan term, 81 through 85. And this is a major priority of the Reagan approach. So defense spending had declined a bit in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. But with Reagan's election, with lots of liberals being defeated, with the country seeming more belligerent towards the Soviet Union, we have a reversal in the overall approach. Secondly, Reagan had been elected with on the argument that tax rates were too high and were stifling economic growth. And he endorsed a proposal that was promoted most passionately by this man, Jack Kemp, former NFL football player who then entered politics and was elected to Congress from Buffalo, and who was the prime author of a measure known as the Kemp-Roth tax bill, which lowered both corporate and personal income taxes with the argument that lower tax rates would stimulate economic growth, and with a more robust economy, the Treasury would actually be getting just about as much money coming in. And this is a photograph of Reagan signing the measure. This photograph is significant, I think, for another reason. Reagan, again, is a former actor. He's very conscious and appreciative of the importance of image. And so imagery plays an important role in the Reagan administration as a way of selling his overall approach. Reagan's standing also increases because of personal tragedy. Shortly into his administration, he is the target of an assassination attempt, not politically based. The man had mental problems. He's shot in the chest, but survives. There are stories told of him joking with the doctors as he goes in. His press secretary is shot in the head, and although he does survive, is never able to sort of go back to his job as press secretary thereafter. And Reagan's ability to sort of survive this assassination attempt largely diffuses the age issue for the remainder of his presidency. And when he returns to the job, there's this outpouring of support for him in a result. Remember, the Reagan approach on the economy had been this twofold one. First, he said that if you lower taxes, you'll get more money coming into the federal government. But he also said the federal government was simply spending too much, and the goal needed to be to cut federal expenditures. This is a meeting of him with David Stockman, who was his budget director, the man who was in charge of coordinating the federal budget under Reagan. But in the end, what Reagan had to do was to make a choice. He could get increased defense spending, he could get cuts to taxes, or he could get cuts to the remainder of the federal budget, but couldn't get all three. And if he had to make a choice between these three, he was largely going to set aside cuts to domestic social programs, which were cutting Social Security or welfare programs or Medicare or Medicaid was much less popular than his calls to cut taxes or to increase defense spending. And the Democrats did retain control of the House of Representatives. And so Reagan essentially worked out a kind of a livable arrangement with Tip O'Neill, who was the Democratic Speaker of the House, who's from Boston, Massachusetts. He had succeeded JFK in the congressional district in Boston. And the arrangement was that domestic programs would continue to rise and be funded, maybe not as much as Democrats wanted, but Reagan largely abandoned efforts to cut most of them. The tax cuts would go through, the defense hike would go through. This was all premised under Reagan's argument that the tax hikes would still be able to fund the budget. That turned out not to be the case for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Laffer curve didn't work out in practice. The revenue didn't increase into the government. Secondly, the deals that Reagan had to do with congressional Democrats led to lots of these new federal programs, the most famous of which was probably this program called the Big Dig. And any of you who have been to Boston in the last decade or so might have seen this kind of spectacular bridge in the city. Boston used to be divided by this thoroughfare called the Southeast Expressway, and that it's being torn down in this photo on the top of the screen. O'Neill secures funding for this program called the Big Dig, which is to tear down the Southeast Expressway, to depress it, create a tunnel, put it underground, and then to route all of the major highways in Boston through this spectacular bridge. It's a great idea in theory. It's a wonderful area to travel now, but it turns out to be extremely expensive, much more than the initial budget. And so domestic programs are never really cut all that much under Reagan. And the result of this is that the budget deficit spectacularly increases during the Reagan years. And this has been a persistent problem, except for a couple of years under Clinton, ever since. A couple other factors that are really important in terms of understanding politics during the Reagan years. The first is this population shift away from what's called the Rust Belt, Northeast and Midwest, and towards what's called the Sun Belt. These states with better weather, with cheaper houses, and this is a population shift you can see from this map in the 1970s. And the incredible thing here is you see huge amounts of population losses in these reddish states: Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois. And huge population gains in the South and Southwest, especially California, Texas, and Florida. Politically, why does this matter? These states that are losing population in massive numbers are disproportionately Democratic states. And the states that are gaining population in massive numbers are disproportionately either Republican states, or in the case of California, California then was a very closely divided state between Democrats and Republicans. So the population shift has the effect of transferring more congressional seats and ultimately more electoral votes towards more Republican states. It creates a map in the 80s that's more favorable to the Republicans. One other critical thing during the Reagan years is that the economy does improve. Now, the Carter people say that it improves because of changes that were put in place under Carter. The Reagan people disagree, and in many ways this is irrelevant. The president who's in office is going to get credit or blame for the performance of the economy. So you can see from these four charts, the upper left chart, the inflation rate declines dramatically during the Reagan years, down to under 2% by 1986. So this threat to middle class buying power largely dissipates. The unemployment rate slowly comes down, but this is only slowly after spiking up. It remains 7% in 1986. The prime rate drops significantly, although not anywhere near as much as it is now, but it goes from 20% to 7% by 1986. And the gross domestic product, a measurement of the overall economic health of the country, also increases basically every year that Reagan is president. And so after a spike in his unpopularity in 81 and 82, when unemployment increased, Reagan becomes more and more popular as his term continues, and that's going to pave the way to our final snippet from this period, which we'll look at the election of 1984.